So in Maryland, we have very specific regulations. Virginia has some specific regulations. I'm sure other jurisdictions have some as well. So in Maryland, we have a specific disclosure. We need to report about CSST. Obviously, our slides are a little odd. So what is the purpose of a home inspection and report? I'm gonna ask Joe first. What's the purpose of a home inspection from your perspective?
From an agent's perspective, I think that it is to find out the facts about what the condition of the home is. Pretty straightforward. Ideally to find as many issues that are likely to arise for the buyer as can be found. And obviously there are certain things that you can't find because you don't have x-ray vision. But to give as factual and thorough an accounting of the condition of the home as possible from my perspective.
There we go. So to educate the client about the condition of the house.
Yes.
Another purpose would be to help the home buyer make an informed purchase decision, protect the health and safety of home buying public. And then we'll go back. Mark to my left, Mark G. What are some of the other purposes of the home inspection?
Well, you've really covered the big things. It's about informing the buyer. The buyer needs to know what the condition of the home is so that they know what costs. Because if they don't know what type of financial costs they may incur, it's problematic, especially if they're pushing it to the limit. But we're really about consumer protection is the big thing.
I'm going to cruise through these disclosures. So one of the topics that we were discussing as we got ready for this program was in your interactions with clients and agents, and then also in your report, how do you handle the minimizers? People that walk around and say, "Oh, that's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. You don't need an anti-tip bracket. Baluster spacing, it's been this way forever. Don't scare my client." And I think maybe I'll start again with Joe, because I don't think Joe operates this way. But it has been my experience where as soon as the inspector starts to explain what's going on, sometimes the agents can step in and I don't know if they're trying to undercut the situation, but they're definitely trying to minimize the situation.
No, they're trying to undercut it. Look, I'd like to believe that every real estate agent is the pinnacle of virtue and honesty, but that obviously is not the case. I think that I'll just explain how I approach home inspections beforehand. When I work with a buyer, I always tell them there's no such thing as a perfect house. The house is going to have defects. That's the way it is. So be prepared for that. And when you write your offer for your $1.3 million whatever home, it's not going to be perfect. There are going to be problems with it. And this is the way it is. And you need to budget. Generally, I say, about 1% of the sale price of a home. So $1 million home, and there's going to be $10,000 worth of things wrong with this house. Right off the bat, seller's not going to fix them. That's the way it is. If you're not prepared for that, don't buy a home. And because that way, when the buyer goes through, they're not shocked and horrified by the fact that they're going to have these defects. And then I don't have to run around and try to minimize it. Obviously, there are agents that don't prep their client ahead of time. And there are agents out there that will absolutely try to minimize it because they just want to make a sale. I'm not an idiot. I know you all have experienced that. And, I'd love to say that doesn't happen, but it does. So from my perspective as an agent, screw them. If those agents are out there trying to take advantage of their client, then they shouldn't be in business. And it's not your job to try to police the realtor associations or the realtors out there. But from my perspective as an agent, I'd rather those agents not be out there. I don't need to be a listing agent with a buyer agent coming in thinking that they're going to pull a fast one on their buyers, because ultimately it's going to come back as a lawsuit in the long run against my seller and me and the other agent. And nobody needs that. So from my perspective, how do I handle minimizers? I mean, I was looking at anti-tilt bracket. I'll tell you a very brief story if I may. Okay. So Hollis has always told me that I should have anti-tilt brackets because, he did the inspection on my own personal home the other day. And, I'm like, yeah, it doesn't have any tilt bracket. These things happen, And did I install one? No. Should I have? Absolutely. And then I was making Thanksgiving dinner, pulled out the turkey, and the whole oven starts to tilt over. I can assure you, the next day I was on the phone with my contractor, like, you got to install the damn anti-tilt device. And I tell that story all the time because I tell my clients, even I, who know these things should be done, didn't get them done. I almost burned myself with the pot on the top because I didn't listen to my inspector. Listen to your inspector and just do the things. That's what needs to be done.
That's a great example because it's often like, oh, you know, if the kid opens the door and climbs up on it, but the more practical application is what you're talking about, pulling out a heavy rack and all of a sudden.
Yeah, I mean, I pulled out the 20-pound turkey and then the whole thing, because the 2 pots of soup were right on the front. The entire thing was front loaded. When I opened that thing up, I mean, it was close to me getting scalded. And, you know, one other example, a saddle valve. I had another inspector who's looked at one of the houses I bought, and it's like, you have a saddle valve that should be replaced. Like, saddle valve, yeah, blah, blah. Came downstairs to my house, I don't know, this was a few years ago. Came downstairs, there's a giant puddle in my basement, like, a goddamn saddle valve. I knew it. I should have replaced it. He told me to replace it. Did I replace it? No. So I tell those stories to my clients all the time. Now, I realize that's a little different from a lot of agents, but I can imagine your frustration from your perspective of agents that are out there intentionally trying to minimize what are important things. And I think that you should be strong and firm with them. You know, I don't have a problem with you being harsh to agents that are misleading their clients. That's my perspective.
So Mark Kramer, I noticed you got your hand up.
Yeah. So look, buyers know when agents are trying to minimize things. And it's very uncomfortable. Are you hearing me?
Your
all right?
sound's not in the PA here yet. You took it off earlier.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hollis can hear you.
We can hear you online.
There we go. Now we're good.
Okay. So buyers know when agents are trying to minimize things, and it's a very uncomfortable situation for them. So, but they're completely aware of what's going on. What I try and do is, and I'm fortunate to work with a lot of agents like Joe on the buyer side who are, you know, ethical and want the best for their clients. But what I try and do is not discuss things in front of an adversarial agent or listing agent. I take the client outside or take them away, get them away from that agent, and then we have a discussion. And if they ask, which they often do at the end, well, what are the problems or how's the house? I say, can't really discuss it with you without the client's permission. It'll all be in the written report. So we try and just minimize that, you know, potential adversarial situation, uncomfortable situation again.
So Mark, if I can, just sticking with you, because our next question is, how do you answer this question? Should I buy this house or would you buy this house? Do you have a response that you have a canned response for that?
Yeah, I usually say I'm really the wrong person to ask because I bought a lot worse houses than this in my life. And the question is really, should you buy this house? Is it right for you? And are you, if you're totally aware of the condition and you're totally aware of the financial aspects of it, and you can afford to fix everything and you can afford to make some future repairs, then there's nothing here that would stop me from buying this house.
I'll often say, I'm not in the market to buy a house right now, so I'm not going to buy it. But the only reason I would say not to buy it is the mortgage, right? I mean, other than that,
I'll often say my perspective is different from yours. As a former contractor, I can fix anything, so nothing really scares me. So our level of, what risk we can take and what we can do is different.
I'll say from my perspective as an agent, the answer that I don't want to hear from an inspector is giving advice as to whether or not it's a good deal. It's not in your purview to know what the terms of the contract are. And the concern that I have is, a house that if it were fully renovated and in good condition would sell for hypothetically $1 million. My client realizes there's $300,000 worth of things wrong, main beam for the structural excuse me, support for the attic is cracked, it's leaking, there's carbon monoxide, there's obvious asbestos issues in the house. Yeah, that's a terrible house. You should not live in it. But if they're buying it for $210,000, who gives a shit? You know, I mean, it doesn't matter that these things are wrong. These things have to be addressed. But from the point of view of the buyer, the repairs will be, say, 800,000. Then, you know, it's 800,000. They're buying it for 200. It's worth $1 million. The numbers work. If they want to buy it, buy it. But I don't need an inspector to come in and say, well, knowing that this has $800,000 worth of things wrong, you should not buy this house. Not knowing what the sales price is, that's a problem for me as an agent.
Agreed. And I've had buyers who bought houses that I wouldn't buy, but they were perfectly aware of the conditions and the costs involved, and they were willing to, you know, assume the risk and buy the house. And absolutely, but I never tell them. Well, I rarely tell them don't buy this house. I mean, the only time I might ever say that is if it's a very young, naive single woman who's buying an old beat up house that needs hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of work that she can't possibly manage. I might say to her, if you were my daughter, I would not recommend you buy this house. Of course, they don't listen, but you know, that's the only time I would. That's the only time I would really say that. I mean, it's you know, you give them the information. If they have an accurate understanding of the condition and the costs involved and the future costs involved, then it's their decision. It's not my decision whether they'd buy the house or not.
So John Craner, if I could go to you on this next question, how do you handle things that no one is going to fix? And I'm assuming we're talking about like an older home, some non-conforming aspects, things that you maybe should tell the client, maybe report about it. But how do you address, you know, low headroom in a stairway, or, you know, wrong kind of handrail, or improper riser heights, things like that?
I usually tell people that things have evolved over the years, and that, like, headroom, for example, may have been allowed when the house was built 100 years ago, but it wouldn't be allowed today. And I basically just tell them what the concerns are, regardless of what the issue is, and let them make the decision whether or not they want to move forward or ask to have something corrected, even if it can be corrected.
I think most of those things that you mentioned turn out to be safety related issues, and that's how I think that I address them. I bring them up as safety concerns. I note that, you know, it's been that way for 100 years. That's the way they built it, and it would be not really cost effective to redo the stairways, but you can do things to mitigate the safety hazards by making sure your railings are in good condition and things like that.
Can I go back to that? I just want to say that, you know, I really appreciate my inspectors pointing these things out. I think it's important that the buyer know these things ahead of time. It's not a question whether or not the buyer needs to know it. It's a question of, from the agent's perspective, of, are you bringing this up in a factual way and explaining that it's an older house? And I sell a lot of old houses. And so I find a great deal of frustration when I have somebody come in to a house that was built in, you know, 1815, and they say, well, you know, the handrail is supposed to be continuous with the turn back. I don't know what the exact term is, but, you know, not have the end sticking out. It's supposed to turn back in. I'm like, dude, this house was built 130 years ago. They did not have that regulation in place. So yeah, note it and say, here's an issue. The house was built 130 years ago. This is the way you're going to have it if you're buying a 130-year-old house, unless you want to change it. But the concern that I have as an agent is having a deal fall through because somebody is putting a 2024 perspective or building code on a house that was built so far long ago that it just doesn't even compute. And you know, again, I'm coming from the agent perspective. I feel a little bit like a sheep in a wolf's den, but you know, the realities I know from your perspective, you're like, this needs to be reported, fair enough. But how you address it to the buyer and explaining to them that this is an issue, this is the issue you're going to have if you're buying a 140-year-old home, that is one thing, but saying it's 140 years old, it needs to be addressed, and it's in the report as must be addressed, that's a problem for me.
So on this next one, and I think our Florida guys might be able to add a little bit more to this, but what is real about defects that make a house uninsurable? And does a home inspector have any responsibility to present that information to their client? And here we have buried oil tanks, knob and tube, fuse panels, FBE panels. You know, do those things make it uninsurable? I know that in Florida, you've got wind mitigation requirements and your 4 points. Do you guys call out, hey, this house is going to have trouble getting insurance?
I do.
I'll answer that. Or Larry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I usually do. If they haven't ordered a 4 points or a wind mitt, and I see things that will very likely flunk the 4 points in the wind mitt, I'll point that out to them and let them know that this may cause problems getting insurance.
Yeah, I agree, and I guess it's kind of unique to Florida, although it's happening in other areas also. I just did a seminar session for California chapter of CREA, and they're starting to see requirements for 4-point inspections out there, and they have no idea what that even means. But basically, it's roof, electrical, plumbing, heating, and cooling. Any defects in those systems have to be fixed before you can get insurance. So, yeah, there are a whole bunch of things, and it's not just FPE panels, the stab block, and the knob and tube, and underground oil tanks, things like that. Galvanized iron water supply piping. It's basically any defect in those systems. If you submit a 4-point with those defects, they're just going to kick it back and say fix these things and get another 4-point. So it's a little bit different world here. It's a little more absolute. Is that those things are a no-go, you know, for obtaining insurance.
So Alan Carson, and again, I appreciate that you spell your name properly. How do you use pictures in your report? And you mentioned this earlier when we were talking, but you did have some things to say about pictures. I'm interested to have you say those again.
Yeah, I think by and large defects need photos, although I don't love a photo of a reverse polarity receptacle with the tester stuck into it. I think that might be a little self-evident. So defect photos where they help the client. And as I said in my comments earlier, to me, the goal of a home inspection report is to help the client, to improve their life, to help them make an informed decision at the point of purchase, and then also throughout the period of home ownership. So a million photos of things that are there to protect the home inspector's butt, I don't think belong in a report. I think inspectors should take those photos, keep them in the files. They're mostly able to attach them to their software and attach them to the report, but in the background, not what the client gets. So the example I mentioned earlier this morning was a garage full of storage certainly limits your inspection of the garage. And you should certainly inform the client that that couldn't be inspected. By the way, when you report a limitation, in my market, we always try to also attach a recommendation to that. It's not enough to say I couldn't get in the crawl space. You say I couldn't get in the crawl space, and someone needs to get into the crawl space to evaluate it, to ensure there are no concealed defects. So a limitation to me is kind of a yellow flag that tells me to make a recommendation to do something. On the photos, defects for sure. Hard to get into places to prove you got there. We talked about that a little bit in another session this morning. So pictures inside the attic, inside crawl spaces, and so on. Some people take photos to prove they got up on the roof, although with the telescopic poles and drones these days, it doesn't really prove much. Might even be from the real estate listing photo. So not even sure that those are worthwhile. But again, unless you're showing your client something and it's there to protect your butt, I would keep those to a minimum. Some guys like to put in photos of the main disconnect for the water, the gas, the electrical. And that's generally trying to be helpful, which home inspectors always do. Whether it's truly valuable to the client, whether they're ever going to think to look at it in an emergency is quite another question. So I like photos probably, and again, it's going to vary with the house all over the map. But if I were to pick a number, I'd say more like 50 than 100 in a typical report. And a lot of photos that are just there to protect the inspector is my pet peeve on reviewing home inspection reports. I don't think it helps the client. I think it distracts from the important information.
No.
I totally agree with Alan's philosophy there. The other comments I would have about photos are, if you're going to use photos, they have to be big enough that people can see them. You know, if you have a report page with 4 or 6 photos on it, the resolution's so low that nobody can make any sense out of it. So I put sometimes 1 photo per page and make it the full width of the page, or 2 photos per page, maybe 3 at the max. And the other interesting point I would make about, you know, Alan, you mentioned the photo of the reverse polarity receptacle. I agree with that, but I find when people are reading the report, unless there's a photo there, they tend to skip over that defect and go on to the next photo for some reason. And they'll call and say, you know, well, you told me the doohickey was broken in the bedroom and I don't see it in the report. And it's always in the report. But if there's not a photo there, for some reason, they don't seem to see it. So I would lean a little bit more towards some generally useless photos just to capture the client's attention when they're looking at the report.
Joe, were you going to say something?
Yeah, from my perspective as an agent, the photos that are important to me are the ones that allow me as a buyer agent to demonstrate to the seller what the issue is. Because a lot of times, you know, when it's a furnace and the flame isn't right, you know, because it's yellow flame instead of blue and there's no photo, I'm like, you know, then the listing agent's like, that's BS. Of course it's fine. I'm like, no, here's the photo, it's wrong. So for me to be able to negotiate and to be able to get the repair made, I need photos of the defect in order to make it easy for the listing agent. And the listing agent needs them because sellers believe their houses are perfect and everyone is out to screw them. So, you know, the sellers really need the photo, because if you say to them, the flame is an easy one, the flame is wrong, here's the photo, it's a lot harder. I mean, they'll still say it's fine, but it's a lot harder to make that argument. And when I am a buyer agent and I have a photo like that, I can send it to my HVAC contractor. He can look at it and go, yeah, the home inspector's correct. Because that's the other argument I always get when I'm the buyer's agent, or when I'm the listing agent, I talk to the seller, is obviously the home inspector knows nothing. He's a fool. I don't need to do it. It's not even a defect. So, you know, that I'm sure you've all heard that, but I need this ammunition for me to be able to go into the battle and win. So that's what I need. The rest of the photos are not terribly important to me. I do like having the photos of the main cutoffs because I get calls from buyers later that ask me that question, and I don't know, I go back and find the PDF and like, it's there. So that's just my perspective.
And then the important thing to remember is don't include a photo in which there's a deficiency you didn't identify. So we're going to switch gears, and one of the things we tried to do with this experiment was Hollis crafted an imaginary house in which he laid all sorts of Easter eggs and trick questions, and then sent it out to the education committee. And the goal was to have us all write our own version of a report, and then we would compare and contrast those. In an effort to do that, we found some parts really weren't going to work, but Anatol, who's joining us, was previously on the DLLR committee for appraisers and home inspectors, and spent a lot of time reviewing complaints and specifically reviewing inspections and their reports for conformance to the standards of practice. So we're going to switch over to Anatol for a few seconds. We're using Hollis's computer, but it's Anatol's spreadsheet. So PowerPoint. So Anatol, go ahead and give us what you got.
Okay, so as part of the complaint committee, just a brief overview, we would get the complaints would come in, we would go over the complaints, and as part of going through the complaints, we would get a copy of the inspection report, we would have a look at that, decide two things. First of all, if the complaint had merit, and if so, sanctions or whatever would be taken care of. The other thing was the actual inspection report itself to make sure that it met the standards. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. In Maryland, there's a whole bunch of standards of practice, but the big thing as far as report writing goes is, and a couple quick definitions is, inspect means to examine the readily accessible systems, blah, blah, blah. And then describe means to describe, means to include in the written report a description of the system or component by its type or other observed significant characteristic to distinguish it from other systems or components. So we can go to the next one. So these things are in Maryland. I'll just go through them real quick. These items must be described to be compliant with the standards of practice. So for the structural system, you must describe the foundation and the report and how you inspected it, underfloor, crawl spaces, and basements. You have to describe the floor structure, the wall structure, ceiling structure, roof structure, and report the methods used to inspect the attic. Almost every report that we had a complaint against, most of these were not addressed. So, and on the exterior, you have to describe the wall coverings. That's all, that's the minimum description that's required. With the roof, you describe the roof covering, so the type of roof covering, blah, blah, and the method used to inspect the roof. With the plumbing, you have to describe the water supply, drain, waste, and venting pipe materials, the water heating equipment, including the energy source, the location of the main water and main fuel shutoff valves, and if it applies, the presence of CSST with the recommendation that it be corrected or make sure that it's properly bonded. The electrical system, once again, these must be described. The amperage and voltage of the system, location of the main disconnect, and any other sub panels or other distribution panels. I don't like sub panels. The wiring methods, and then if you had solid aluminum on the branch circuit wiring, you have to describe that. The absence of smoke detectors, and once again, they add the CSST into the electrical section to make it even more confusing. Heating systems, you have to describe the energy source and the heating method by distinguishing characteristics and means of distribution. So if it's a boiler, radiators, boiler, steam, simple stuff. And the same with the air conditioning. For the interior section, there are no required descriptions. So there's that. And then in the insulation and ventilation section, you have to describe the in unfinished spaces, and if applicable, the absence of insulation in unfinished spaces. And then with the fireplaces and solid burning fuel appliances, you have to describe the fireplace, solid fuel burning appliances, and the chimneys. So those are the things that you must, the minimum standards. The other thing is you have to include this, the paragraph, or let me go back. In one of the reports that we reviewed that Hollis sent, it says the inspection will be performed in a manner consistent with the standards of the American Society of Home Inspectors, home inspection licensing law, exclusions noted by law, inspection agreement, and limitations noted in the report. So in this case, and in a lot of the reports that we reviewed, the standards of practice that the home inspector would cite was not Maryland standards of practice. It was the standards of practice that came with their inspection software. So they were not in compliance. So if you should make sure that your report, if you are citing the standards of practice, make sure that it's the Maryland standards of practice. If you're working in Maryland, if you're in Virginia, it should be Virginia's, but I only know about Maryland. So each inspector needs to evaluate the software that he or she is using to make sure that it's compliant with the state that you're in. And as I said, most of the reports that we reviewed, they were not compliant. This is an example of, this is one of the reports that we received. And the way that the reporting system was, areas that require attention would be highlighted in yellow. Areas that were routine maintenance or monitoring were blue, and then additional general background information is contained in blue text. So this is instead of saying great, marginal, poor, satisfactory, whatever. So that's it. They were sort of using those color codes. I have a hard time seeing some of those colors, and they don't always print very well. So I think that's just one concern that I would have with that style of reporting, is if it's going to be printed on paper, there's the high likelihood that it's not going to be in color properly, and it's not going to translate well. It's a minor thing, but it was a thing that I noted. So this is an example of in the electrical section. So the main disconnect is located by the meter, and it's my screen's a little strange. So the original house panel, I got to put my glasses on so I can see this. All right, so this is the initial description of the electrical section. Now, if we go to the next slide, you'll see that we have a main disconnect located outside by the meter. Oops, go back. So the main disconnect is in the first paragraph, and then there's another main disconnect at this panel. And then further down, it says the main breaker is likely to be located at the electric meter. So it's very confusing here to me. Typically, I would expect there would be one main disconnect for a service, and then other disconnects would not be considered the main disconnect. And the reason for that is we have the issue of bonding and grounding the neutrals and things like that. So I think that it's important that the report should be clear, and there shouldn't be any confusion about another main disconnect, because there can only be one main disconnect, in my opinion. We go to the next one. So we're talking about there's one, so that there should be only one main disconnect. Now, in dual services, you can have two independent panels with disconnects. And then there are sometimes emergency disconnects on newer construction. So that's a little bit different, but I recommend using terms such as service panel for the main panel and distribution panel for additional panels instead of sub panels. I'm not sure that sub panel actually is a term that exists in the NAC. I think it's just sort of what we call it colloquially. Now, this report had a really good explanation of the concerns provided by improper bonding of the grounds and neutrals after the main panel, and so that was a good thing in that report, and it was well written. I won't, it went really well. This is the heating and cooling section, and there's let's see. So there's two systems. There's one in the main house and one in the addition. It's the heat source in the addition is a heat pump, and it's gas fired in the original. And then in the comment, the yellow comment, it says the AC for the addition did not appear to be operating normally. There was no split, and the recommendation is to have it further evaluated, which is fine. And we go to the next slide. And then, so they're talking once again about the heat, and the let's see. Yeah, and it says the addition heat source is a heat pump with the air handler located in the crawl space. He says the heat at both units tested functional. Now, my concern with this part of it was the AC, the heat pump for the addition, didn't appear to be wasn't operating normally. So it was the heating system that was tested was probably the emergency heating strips and not the heat pump function. So, and that wasn't really clear in this report. So that was a little bit of a concern that I had. You go to the next one. Yeah, so it's important that when you do test two systems, that you tell how the system was tested, just to make it clear to the client, because my concern with this one was, since the system, the heat pump was evaluated and reported as functional for a call for heat, then there's the possibility that the buyer says, well, the heating's working fine, and they may not know that the heat pump and does both sides of it. So it's a good idea to expand on the concerns of a heat pump not working in cooling mode, because it's not going to work in heating mode. And it's also a good place, if you do temperature splits, to use those to back up your findings that the cooling system on the heat pump wasn't working right. Let's see. This is the plumbing section, and this is the discussion about blue poly coming in, and that was all fine. The only issue that I had with this particular part of the plumbing section was on the next line, the next slide. Yeah, the good explanation of the blue poly concerns. And it says that the main shutoff valve was not located during the inspection. So that was properly noted, because if you can't describe where it is, you have to tell them why. But there is no required description of the location of the main fuel shutoff valve. And that is a requirement by the standards of practice. So it's important that that be noted. In the attic structural section, there's this description of the roof structure and the trusses and the plywood. And then obviously there's a staining that was noted in the report, which is fine. And then move on. But there's no description in the report on the method used to view and inspect the attic. Once again, that is a requirement. And then depending on the severity of the staining noted in the attic space, maybe a little bit more discussion of the problem with lack of or excessive moisture getting into the attic, or lack of ventilation would have been helpful to the client. Report number 2 was a checklist format. It wasn't filled out, so I couldn't really comment on it. I think a lot of clients and agents would like to have photographs in their reports, not just a checklist, because if there are issues, once again, photographs are very helpful, can be very helpful. And this is an example of the checklist. As I say, it wasn't really filled out, so I couldn't evaluate it I just couldn't. But that's an example of a checklist style report, and there's not a lot of room for narrative, and so I think it may limit the communication between the the inspector and the buyer, and it just may mean more callbacks, because the buyer may have questions that are not addressed. This is another report format with the same property. This one was really pretty good. And the thing I liked about it best was in the recommendations section. If you go to the next slide, just before we get to that, the required 4 paragraph 14-point bold disclosure was not included in the inspection report, in this report. Once again, that is part of the standards of practice, so it would be non-compliant. Next.
Actually, Anatol, can I interrupt you real quick?
Yeah.
With regard to that, does that need to be in the report, or you just
Yes.
need to give it to your client?
It needs to be in the report.
All right.
Now, in this style of reporting, the one that we just started with, in the observation and recommendation sections, there's a really good use of condition, implications, task, and time. Other people have different ways of doing it, like describe the problem. What does it really mean? What should we do about it? And then what is the time frame for doing it? This is all really good. This type of framing gives the client a lot of good information, because they understand that, there's a problem, it has implications, what has to be done, and when does it have to happen. So I think that's all inspection reports should have, this sort of description when there's a defect, because it just makes it super clear that this is a problem and it needs to be addressed. So my only suggestion was, in this particular case, was the comments were very short and sort of using a inspector shorthand. So if, for example, here we have a condition: structure significantly compromised, apparent settlement, undersized structural elements, no evidence of building permits, implication likely to persist, significant cost, may require significant rebuilding effort, where it was, and then the task is to get it fixed. I prefer a more narrative way of expressing exactly. The sediments are great. I just think it would be, if we could stretch it out a little bit in a couple complete sentences, it might have a little more impact for the buyer. Next. Once again, this is the same thing. We have a condition, the sump pump failure. In this case, there's no, you don't need to, it's like replace it. And that makes perfect sense. The implication there, I mean, there is an implication, but your basement could flood, but the task is replace, and that's just fine. And I had no issue with this. The shower pan, that's always a good thing to put in your report because they're all going to leak.
Can I interrupt? Can I go back to that previous slide for a moment? What I like as an agent is the way the task is spelled out, because as an agent, when you're doing the negotiation, you have to fill out a home inspection report, a home inspection notice, and to say, that there's to have exactly what you think is wrong written out in a way that it can be cut and pasted so that it then can be given to the other party so that it can be addressed is incredibly helpful. When there are things in there like radon issue needs to be addressed, well, that doesn't really help me a lot. What needs to happen? Well, the radon's a bad example, but defect in the HVAC, okay, what needs to be done? Because that's what I need as an agent, is to have something where I can just cut it and paste it so I don't have to interpret what it is that needs to be there. And then, as you know, I sure as hell am not qualified to describe things and what needs to be done. So the more you can give that the agent can then cut and paste, the better the report.
Yeah, as I said, the information that was provided in this particular report I thought was really good, but I think the communication part, it could have been expanded upon. That's all. Also in this report, the heating and cooling sections, they only describe the equipment. There's no mention of any defects or concerns that were noted in the report exercise. And I don't know if that was because he ran out of time, or I don't know. I don't know anything about that. So I just noted that.
Anatol, we have a question here in the audience or a statement.
Actually, I have two questions. The first question is for the realtor up there. In my reporting software, I have the option to password protect the report. So I can give you that report, but it's password protected. And I've had pushback because the realtor was unable to cut and paste, as you said, to the seller or buyer, what have you. What is your thoughts on that?
Well, I understand.
PDF editor.
Yeah, and look, I understand the perspective of the fact that I, as the agent, didn't pay for the inspection. I'm not the owner of the report. And, I do understand there are many inspectors out there that believe that the report should go from them to the client, and then the client can pass it along if they choose. But as an agent, that drives me bananas. Look, my objective here is there's a defect in the home. My buyer wants to buy the home. They want the defect addressed. Why do I have to go through this giant hurdle of trying to figure out how to get this done? Ultimately, candidly, what I do in a situation like that is if I print it, I scan it, I use optical character recognition, cut and paste. So all it's really doing is causing me to go through an extra 3 minutes of baloney when I could just not have a password protected.
See, the problem the problem the inspectors have is that they'll take our report and then use it for multiple clients.
I can respect that concern. Yeah, no, it never occurred to me, because I've never once I've been doing this 25 years, never occurred to me once to do that. But because I don't have multiple buyers right on the same property.
You sound more of an ethical inspector that we don't run across often.
But no, I understand. I respect that. And I can also, especially in a situation like we were in the pandemic, when there are, 22 offers on a property, and maybe there's a buyer agent out there who's just trying to get a fast one and do it that way. That could be frustrating for you. I respect that. But that, from my point of view, if I'm not trying to screw you, it's a real pain in my ass.
Well, we've got a chat question too that's related to this.
Question for the speaker we had. He was from the state of the board from Maryland, and he stated DLR, Board of Realtors and Inspectors, to follow ASHI standards and practice and Maryland. They conflict. We are Maryland inspectors in Maryland. We must follow Maryland standards of practice. They are similar to ASHI's, but they are not the same.
Yeah, that's correct. So if you were to have a complaint and for some reason, you know, your report didn't meet the Maryland standards, then you would be potentially, you know, you could be sanctioned by the commission. So anybody who's practicing in Maryland should make sure that their report software at least meets the minimum standards for Maryland.
So Larry, you had something?
Yes, the question is how it was relating to the shower pan aspect of this report. And the question is, how would you know the shower pan is near the end of its life? You can't see it. And who would replace a shower pan that wasn't leaking? So,
Okay, well, I like Ruben, I used to flood them all the time, and you know, especially on flip houses, because it was no big deal, and it only took 10 seconds, you know, and then it would be coming through the ceiling, and there was almost no damage, but it was, you know, but with these older houses, you know, 50-60-year-old house, you know that it's going to be leaking. In the very near future, they got metal pans. Sometimes you can see it in the garage below. Sometimes you can see it in the ceiling below. You don't always. It's just a good comment to say that shower pans are prone to shower pans like that, built up tile ceramic pans are prone to leaking, especially after a significant amount of time. So, all right. Anything else on that slide? No. All right. So in the reports that I went over, in the information that Hollis provided, there was some other stuff that didn't get mentioned. One of them was the recall for the certain type of square D panels manufactured during a specific time. There was also no mention of the orphan water heater venting situation that was described. Obviously, if you run into a situation like that, a chimney liner is really highly recommended. And then there was a comment in one of the reports in the finished basement. The inspector was recommending a dehumidifier, but there was a cooling system in the house, and the basement was conditioned. So I'm not sure why the recommendation was there for to add a dehumidifier, because if the cooling system is operating properly, it is going to remove that latent heat, the humidity. So
Anatol, when I wrote that particular part of that exercise, that report writing exercise, where I put enough information that someone who was familiar with that square D recall would pick up on it, the question in my mind as I wrote it was, are the inspectors going to pick up on that and put it in their report? Or were they going to say to themselves, I don't check for recalls, and just simply ignore it? So I find it interesting that you're saying that you suggest that we should. And I guess the question that I hear frequently, the response to that is, well, if I start pointing out recalls, am I now liable for all of the recalls?
well, I think a lot of people are afraid of things like that. I am not particularly concerned about it. I have a Google alert for recalls, right? So every time something comes up that's on a recall that concerns anything in home inspection, it goes into my file. And then this was, I think, wasn't this mentioned at one of the at the ASHI meetings? I'm pretty sure it was. So, you know, I mean, if you're aware of the situation, you should report it. If you're not aware of it, then you're not. But, you know, I just think if you are aware, it's a good thing to know and to include and tell your client. And it's, you know, it's an easy fix. They come out, they torque up a couple things, they put a little green sticker on it, and you're good to go.
but it's nothing that would get a Maryland inspector in trouble if they didn't mention it. Correct?
Probably not, because in the standards, or in the rules, the regs, I think there's a direct limitation. I'd have to go back and double check, but I think there's a direct limitation that says we're not responsible for recalls, items that have been recalled. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's in there.
So John Craner, we're not going to ask you to do the same exercise with Virginia, but I'm wondering if you want to, this is a good opportunity for you to chime in with anything that's Virginia specific along these lines before we move on.
Well, I will add that in Virginia, if you're not going to check recalls, you have to have it in your contract. It's a Virginia regulation. And I want to point out that, like it's already been said, that Virginia and actually most states, your regulations are not optional. They're the law. It's codified into the law. You have to. That's the minimum standard, unless you're in a state that allows you to pick a standard. But I think there's very few that do that. Is there anything else you want me to address specifically?
I think mainly he was just saying is in your reviews or in complaints or in your review of reports that come across your desk, is there anything that stood out that you want to convey to licensed Virginia inspectors?
What I see mostly is core descriptions. And I'll kind of go backwards a little bit to the photo situation where I had a disciplinary action on an inspector that he reported that he reported that the attic had been on fire, but he did not say. What he said was that the wood was blackened, and he did note that he had limitations in the attic. Unfortunately, he took a photo of a air handler that was in the attic, and the photo showed charred wood. And the lady who complained said it cost her $150,000 to fix it. And of course, he was sanctioned because of his poor description. And very unfortunate. I think he just made a mistake, but it's a costly mistake. That's pretty much what I see as poor descriptions, not being in compliant with the regulations. And I do want to point out that Virginia regulations are very different than Maryland and the ASHI standards, and most states actually. It's you have to describe everything that Anatol mentioned and then a lot more. And it's just the way it's worded. I wasn't the author of it, so I'm not in favor of it. I'm much more in favor of the ASHI standards.
All right, so we're going to move on from this a little bit. I think in the future, though, it would be a good exercise to do those side-by-side comparisons of the reports and sort of provide some good feedback on those different formats. The next question is, how do you
I'm
balance?
sorry, could I add one thing?
Yeah.
It's just super important that home inspectors proofread their reports, because a lot of them don't. They just don't, and they're in such a hurry, and they hit that send button, and it's full of typing errors. It's full of actual errors that, they'll have a photograph of the HVAC equipment, and it'll be a Goodman condenser, and they'll label it as an Amana. I mean, stupid stuff like that if you just took the time to read the report through at least once before you send it, and just double check it to make sure it says what you want it to say, because once it's gone, it's out there. And if there are factual errors in it, it could be a problem for you. That's all.
So our next question is, how do you balance the use of recommending further evaluation? And I get this pushback from agents all the time. Do I need to do this? Do I need to do that? And in my reports, I use it just to tell them who the right contractor is that should look at it. And the main reason I use that further evaluation is because this is the defect that I see. but the cause of it could be something else. And the only way you're going to figure out what it is if somebody comes to look at it. But I understand that sometimes people use it so much. And I think the sense here is that they're just going to further evaluate without actually forming an opinion. I'm curious, Alan Carson, if you have any input on what the balance is about when to say it needs to be looked at and when to actually have an opinion.
Yeah, it's tough to have a broad rule because so many cases are different, but I do find a lot of home inspectors, the classic one that I recently looked at was the roof had been hail damaged and the roof was completely destroyed. And the home inspection report recommended a roofer to evaluate it. I'm going, to do what? How about having a roofer replace it? So the common sense thing is to get it fixed. And I go back to one of the other mistakes I see on further evaluation is it's okay to recommend that somebody should look at it to decide how to fix it, because that's not our role. But only in rare cases should we be telling them to do further evaluation to figure out what's broke. So I would use it sparingly when necessary. And again, the yardstick that I keep coming back to is, what do I need to do to help my client make a great decision? And if I can't make the call to help him, then I do have to call for further evaluation. But as you insinuated, Alan, there's a lot of home inspectors who pull back from making a decision and from offering a professional opinion. There's a very good talk, and it might be Hollis's, I can't remember, about the difference between reporting a fact and a professional opinion. And we are absolutely entitled to offer a professional opinion, but when we do that, we should make clear that it is an opinion, not a fact. So a long rambling answer, but in our organization, my company, I try to avoid further evaluation as much as possible. I don't think it helps the client or agent to any great extent.
Our next question is, should one exceed the SOP? And I think we've had this discussion at ASHI where we have people that are like strict SOP guys. Like if it exceeds the standard, you shouldn't be doing it. And then we have guys that kind of pick and choose, you know, where they exceed. And then we have other people that are doing a technically exhaustive, fully beyond the SOP. And so Mark Kramer, I'm curious what your thoughts are on, should you exceed the SOP? What are the risks associated with going beyond the standards of practice, regardless of the jurisdiction?
Well, the classic argument against that is that should you be involved in some litigation related to this inspection and you exceed the standards in one area, you're going to be blamed for not exceeding the standards in another area. I don't know how real that risk is, but I think you just have to go with what you as an individual inspector are comfortable with. If you have the knowledge and you're certain about an issue, then I do this myself, I exceed the standards at some point during some inspection. But it's kind of a double-edged sword, I think. And if you don't have the knowledge, then you're probably better off just sticking to the standards.
That's good advice. Shane, you had something?
Yes. So one of the things that you guys are talking about was ASHI versus Maryland versus Virginia. And John was talking about some of the things in Virginia that are required, right? And there's actually quite a bit of things required in Virginia that Maryland doesn't have, for example. On ASHI's website, in the download section, is a compare contrast of ASHI, Maryland, and Virginia standards. I recommend everybody take a look at those and make sure that you're actually abiding by the rules in any of the jurisdictions that you're doing the inspections in. That is available on the downloads.
So I'll say that Shane actually put that together and walked us all through it several years ago. And I actually go back to it. I try to once a year because I do 15% of my business is in Virginia, 45 or so in Maryland, and the rest is in DC. And Virginia does have some squirrely things that that aren't in mine, and I keep having to kind of dig through it and go, okay, I got to put that little thing in there. I got to put that little thing in there, just so it is conforming. And that side-by-side comparison is very helpful.
A great one that most software, you actually have to do like a specific edit to make it happen. Everybody has a start time for their inspections, but most don't have the stop time, and that's required in Virginia.
Should home inspectors be trained better to understand the real estate transaction process? Joe?
Well, honestly, I'm sitting here thinking, why aren't agents better trained in the home inspection world? Because, some of the things that you're talking about here, I did not know. And I consider myself to be a pretty knowledgeable agent. So I think it'd be useful for agents to hear more directly from you guys. I'm not sure how much you guys really need to be involved in it. I mean, it's horrible enough to be an agent. There's no reason for you to suffer. I think the biggest thing that would be helpful is for you guys to understand how the agent takes the information you give and handles the negotiation. If you understood that, then I think that you would be much more useful to the agents. If you knew that the thing that we need is from the buyer, and frankly, you don't really care about the listing agent or the seller, that's not your place. But from the buyer agent point of view, to know to talk to your buyer's agents and ask them how you can structure the report in a way that makes the negotiation of the inspection effective, that would be the best thing that you could do. Whether or not there's a home inspection contingency, I think it's valuable for you to know that, because from an agent's perspective, there's obviously a lot more leeway in the agent's perspective of things when there's a contingency for it. And you definitely have your heart in your hands a little bit more as an agent if there's no contingency, because obviously you don't want to find out the house is terrible. But it's not your role to worry about whether or not the agent's going to be anxious about it or whether or not the buyer is. It's your role to report it. So I just think it's useful for you to know whether or not it's there, so you know how to express the concerns you have in the right way for the person. Because if there's no way out of the deal, you can, again, and this is me talking on both sides of my mouth, I'll be frank. On the one hand, absolutely have to report it. On the other, there's ways for reporting the same thing in one way that makes the person freak out and ways that don't. You all know that. And knowing whether or not it's a situation where the person is going to be able to walk is important for how you phrase things.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to know whether there's a contingency or not, because it definitely affects the way you present information. And it helps the agent and the inspector work together to serve the client in the client's best interest. The client's fixated on having the seller fix everything. That's not going to happen. And the agent kind of needs a little bit of help in presenting it that way. Say, this is an issue. It needs to be corrected. Doesn't matter who corrects it. It's just got to be done. And knowing whether there's that contingency or not is definitely helpful.
And also if it's a pre-offer inspection, because if it's pre-offer, there's a different perspective that buyers have, because they're going to use that knowledge of what's wrong with the house to alter the amount they're willing to purchase the property for if they ultimately make a bid on the property. So I would assume that would be helpful for you guys just to know that, so that you don't have the agent going, what the hell are you doing? And you're going, well, why didn't you tell me? So if the agent doesn't tell you, I think it'd be helpful for you to ask what the status of the situation is.
This might be a good time to interject. Maybe have Anatole and John both comment about the legal aspects of the walk and talk.
Yeah. Love that.
Walk and talk, observation walkthrough, quick and dirty, lots of different phrases.
Major defects only is the one that I hear from some.
In some ways, it's that 4-point on a different scale. I'm curious to hear, at least from the guys that enforced this or are part of that, what your, it looks like we might have lost John, so I'll go to Anatole. Anatole, what do you think about walk and talks?
I realize that there is a place for them. I don't like doing them. I have done them. The it came up before the commission and we discussed it. And basically, if you go to the website, you can see the commission's official response. But basically, it comes down to if there's no written report generated, it is not considered to be a home inspection by the state. So it is not governed or regulated by the commission. That's basically what it comes down to. So it's from a home inspector point of view, it's a survey, it's a consultation, it's anything but a home inspection as defined by Maryland state regulations.
What about, I was going to ask, is at least the panel, if you do walk and talks, do you have a contract that reflects that, or do you get a contract under that?
If you don't, you're an idiot. You have to, anybody who does anything without a contract is just asking for trouble. The only thing that we did say on the website is that a home inspector who misrepresents a walk and talk or any other type of consultation that does not result in a written evaluation as defined by the state to be a valid home inspection may be subject to regulatory action by the commission. So, you know, if you misrepresent a walk and talk as an inspection, then you're in trouble with the commission. But as long as you don't, and you know, and if you're a smart person, you have a contract when you do these things that explains to the client exactly what it is. They agree to it. They understand. I mean, you know, they're not usually stupid, and they're aware of the market situation that's forcing them into this position. They don't like it any more than anybody else, but it's a market-driven situation, and you know, there's a lot of desperate people who want a house, and they're willing to do it. So we can only help as much as we can, but we can't. You know, if we're not generating a written report, it's not a home inspection. It's just that simple.
And John seems to be having a little bit of technical difficulties on his end, but for
Well, he just-
Virginia, I can help answer that question as well. It's basically the same thing that DLLR said. It is not considered an inspection if it doesn't have a report, so it's not regulated by a DPOR, and therefore they are not overseeing it. But if you misrepresent a consultation, walkthrough, whatever, as an inspection, you will be hammered. It's they're gonna hit you hard on it because you are, as a licensed home inspector, expected to do the full standard of practice. And just like he was saying about Maryland, if you don't have a contract, especially in Virginia, Virginia is very pro persons there, consumers. If you don't have a contract spelling out exactly what you're doing and what the exceptions are and everything, expect to have a problem. And then the other thing to think about too is if for those that do have E&O insurance, a lot of them don't realize that the E&O insurance is not covering consultations. There's a couple companies that do, you have to check with them. That's your own company that you have, but realize your limitations are greatly reduced in reference to that.
I think right now would be a good time to just address the NAR situation, and I'm going to defer to you for a little bit of help on this. And in actually bringing this up, there was some discussion that, like, why do we care? Why are we even talking about it? It has nothing to do with us. To actually, this is really important because it may change the way transactions go. And depending on what your referral network is like, you may find your referral network disappears. So what happened with the NAR? How's it affecting our market in the district area? And what do you know about it?
Well, you know, the ultimate answer is that it's consumer advocate attorneys and the Department of Justice want to separate commissions such that the seller does not offer compensation to buyers agents through their broker through the multiple listing service. The long and short of it is they're trying to separate the payment so that the buyer pays for the buyer's agent and the seller pays for the seller's agent, the listing agent. Nobody knows what's going to happen with this. And if anybody tells you they do, they're lying. I think the consumer advocates are going to be sorely disappointed that buyer agents won't disappear, because I think that they believe that buyer agents are both useless and overpaid. So I obviously, since I work as a buyer's agent, I disagree with that. What is going to happen probably is that buyer agents will not be offered compensation directly through the multiple listing service. The expectation at this time is that a buyer agent, if I were a buyer and I want to show a property that is listed with another agent, I would say, I would like to show this property. Prior to me showing it, what is the offer of compensation that you are giving? And if it is insufficient for the agreement between the buyer and the buyer's agent will notify the buyer. The buyer will know that they'll have to make up the differential and then probably show the property. After they show the property, if the buyer wants to buy the property, the buyer's agent will call the listing agent and say, I have an offer for your home. In order for me to present this offer to you, you will have to pay me X amount of commission. If you don't want to pay the commission, I will not present the offer. Ask your seller what they'd like to do. What seller at that point is going to go, oh my goodness, I sure as heck don't want to get an offer, so I'm not going to offer. The seller doesn't care. The seller is going to say, if I get my net, I don't care. That's what the expectation is. We don't know if that's really going to happen. The other question is, of course, if there are multiple offers on a property, are buyer's agents all going to try to cut their commissions so that their net to their buyer is lower? I don't know. Nobody knows. There is a perception that about 30% of the agents will leave the business due to this. And the vast majority of the agents that will leave will be the buyer's agents. And until I saw this slide, it never really occurred to me to really, I hate to say this, think about the home inspectors, because I was more worried about my own ass rather than yours. But yeah, I mean, if 30% of the buyer agents disappear, it could severely impact your ability to get referrals. And in my experience, despite the fact that many people say you should never choose your home inspector from your buyer's agent, most buyers use the inspector their buyer agents recommend. And I think it could potentially negatively impact your ability to make a living in this job.
Good information. Do you have any tips on time management? And I'll go back to Alan Carson on this because you touched on it earlier when you mentioned that writing a report and getting it out the door should only take an hour or two. I wish that were the case with my reports. So on our list here, we have, preparation, organization, standardization, inspection process, data gathering, report generation. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your approach to how your inspectors do this and how they get that information to the client.
Yeah, and I knew that would be a lightning rod comment because most home inspectors do spend more than an hour. And we have a process that our software is designed to accommodate, wherein our field data collection tool allows us to move quickly. By the way, one horrible thing about using phones to do home inspection reports is there's typically a lot of pages to scroll through, and navigating on a phone is a pain in the butt. I really like search. We spent a lot of time refining our search, and home inspectors use different terms. So beam and purlin are two different words for similar things. There's 500 of those in home inspection. We've driven our search so that whichever word you put in, it'll take you to the right spot, make the data entry. And the goal of our exercise is in one click, be able to find the item you're looking for, make the entry, and take the photos that automatically attach to that item in the report. And as I mentioned earlier, I like a macro and a micro. So if I've got a high efficiency furnace with a leaking condensate drain, I'll take a picture of the furnace from back 10 feet and then take a close up with the condensate drain leaking. So in the field data collection, that's one way that we try and speed things up. Our speed write tool is another, where my personal philosophy is when you do a home inspection, you don't need to stop and write down description and limitation details as you go through. You should be walking through whatever your process is, exterior clockwise, counterclockwise, up the roof, down the roof, start at the bottom, work your way up, go through again, testing the HVAC, whatever your system is, I don't really care. But don't stop and write stuff down. Grab the defects as you come across them with a single click and a photo, and you're done. And you can fill in all the implications, location, task, and time later. Or better still, our software is set up so that you can have that automatic. So if the furnace is worn out, the task is going to be replaced. So you can have presets there that pick this up. And what's the implication of a worn out furnace? No heat, for example. So that can all be done for you and produced in the output of the report. So you go through, you make the, you write down, you capture the defects, and then at the end, you use the tool that allows you to go through all your descriptions and limitations, and you don't have to navigate. You put in one that takes you to the next one. So what's the roofing material? What's the siding material? All the things that in your various standards you have to include, and you go through all those. You don't have to navigate. You don't have to go anywhere, and you don't have to break your rhythm of the inspection. You do that all at the end. If you can't remember the size of the water heater, for example, you can just walk over to the water heater and check it, but do it in the house at the end of the inspection. So that means that your report is substantially done by the time you leave the house. And when I say less than an hour, I'm cheating a little bit, because if you do your data collection elegantly and you've got your software set up properly, you're really just polishing, filling in the details. I don't love writing sentences. I'm going to disagree with Anatole a little bit, because I know very few inspectors who have taken technical writing courses, and I, myself included, find that the more I write, the more mistakes I make. There's grammatical mistakes, typo mistakes, wrong word mistakes. And I'm on Anatole's page completely, is that home inspectors should proofread their report. I'm desperate about that in agreement. The real world tells me they don't. So the more you write, the more you're going to screw up, quite frankly. So getting that report polished and out the door should take less than an hour, in my opinion, about 9 times out of 10.
So just, I want to do a quick survey, because my memory is, Mark Kramer, you came to Mac ASHI about 20 years ago and did a report writing seminar. And I want to say at that time that what you were using was your own Word document based thing. And I think Larry kind of has his own. I'm curious if you're using a software, and you can either name it or not name it. And then I actually want to ask Anatole and John and Mark the same question. So just quickly, do you use a proprietary software system, Mark?
I use a software system that I developed myself.
And then Larry, how about you?
No, I use a developed one that actually Mike Lennon developed it years and years ago, but I'll probably be switching over to Alan pretty soon.
And Anatole, what about you?
I use one that I made.
And John?
I use Home Inspector Pro.
And Mark?
I use Home Gauge, but we're moving away from it.
I use 3D, so there's lots of different systems out there. What's wrong with me working on a house I inspected? Well, depending on where you live, there's laws about it. It's bad form. You should work on your marketing so you're not doing work on houses and you're just doing inspections.
I would not want to work with an inspector who does the work themselves.
Yeah.
That would be bad. That would be me doing the inspection too. Trust me, I'll do your home inspection. There are no defects. Let's move on. No, nobody wants that.
And then how about inspecting a house that I worked on? And this has happened to me quite a few times, only because I was a residential remodeling contractor for a number of years before I became a home inspector. And so I have had the opportunity to go back to properties that I did work on 15, 20 years ago. I don't have an issue with it. I mean, the house today is not the house it was then.
I would probably decline that opportunity. Just
I would
because
prob-
there's
I-
Disclose it.
there's always the perception that you're conflicted, whether you are or not. The perception is the reality.
I agree with Mark that the perception's a reality, but I think there's a magic in disclosure. That when someone approaches you to do that, say, I'm happy to do the inspection for you, but you should understand that 15 years ago, I put the addition on the house. Happy to have you work with me or find a different inspector. Then I think that puts all the cards on the table and people can make an informed decision. To me, conflict of interest usually comes because somebody got surprised. Somebody didn't know. And so to me, being upfront, honest, and proactive about it takes the issue off the table most of the time.
Mark Goodman echoed that same sentiment about just the importance of disclosure. So I'll turn to Mark now.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Alan said. You know, if you're going to do it, at least disclose it. And probably the time frame would have more of an impact if it was something more recent than if it was something long ago. I used to be a contractor, so the same situation could impact me.
What do you include in a condo inspection? I'm gonna stick with you.
Oh, you're looking at me. Well, the interior, obviously, the things that are the homeowner's responsibility, but I report on where the disconnect is. If I see a problem with a multi-gang meter base, if I see, I'll walk around the entire structure, and if I see something that's big and could potentially result in a special assessment, I'll report on it. Okay. And sometimes you don't know what's your responsibility and what the homeowner's responsibility is and what the association's responsibility. So in those cases like decks and balconies, I'll report on it. I'll say this may be the responsibility of the homeowners association. But I can tell you, I did a condo inspection about a year ago, and the entry to the house was attached villas, was on the side of the home, halfway back, and there was a retaining wall there that made it possible for that sidewalk to be there. According to the association docs, it should have been the association's, but that retaining wall needed to be replaced. It couldn't be fixed. And the association was arguing that it wasn't their responsibility. I noted it. I didn't know, I assumed it was the association's responsibility, and I put my line in there. This may be the responsibility of the homeowners association. But ultimately, that they fought over it, and I believe the association agreed to cover half of it. But if I hadn't reported that, those people would have been in a world of hurt. And if I hadn't reported it and there was a special assessment, they wouldn't have been very happy with me.
I find a lot at least in DC that access to the electric meter is virtually impossible because it's locked behind the third door and you need to make an appointment with the super to get to it. Similarly, the roofs can be a challenge. Though oftentimes if you go up to the roof access and you look closely, sometimes the combo is written in the corner where somebody's left it, or the combination code is always one digit off, or it's the address. So there are definitely ways to get on the roof. But this next slide, I think, nope, where is it, Hollis? Nope, not there. We had an image of what happens when you don't go on the roof. It's not there.
I
Well,
just
he's
like,
looking for a picture of a condominium roof where all of the condensing units were up on platforms, and the one that was being inspected, the whole unit had fallen off the platform and was lying on its side on the roof. It was still getting good readings, good temperature readings.
I just want to point out that I think that from my point of view as an agent, it would depend on the size of the condominium. If it's one of these, in the city, it's a converted Victorian row house, then, a lot of the things that are included on your inspection, things that would otherwise technically like the hallways, which are not part of the owner, I would still want my inspector to take a look at. On the other hand, if it was I don't know, again, I work a lot in the city. If it's one of these complexes that has 45 buildings in the complex, and then it has a central pool that's used by all of them, I don't want my inspector to go take it upon himself to drive over to the pool and check out the pool for my buyer, because that has no bearing. So I think some common sense has to be in there. But as a general rule, I prefer my inspector to be doing the inspection of the unit, because that's the scope of the inspection, and the things that are outside of that are handled in a different section of the contract than the home inspection, because that would be part of the condominium document review period rather than part of the home inspection review period.
I think that's a good point about when the homeowner association is a smaller pool, it becomes much more important for them to know, hey, the roof needs to be replaced.
Yeah.
And
If you're in a 4-unit building and the roof needs to be replaced and it's going to be $100,000, that's something they need to know. But yeah.
One
Is
of
it
the other
okay-
things, I'm sorry, one of the
Go
other
ahead.
things that is a lot of times when you go to a condo, they haven't received the condominium docs yet, so they don't know the answer to the question. So when you ask them who's responsible for the window, who's responsible for whatever, they'll look at me and say, we don't know yet. We haven't gotten the docs yet. So
Yep.
at that point, in my condo report, right on the top, there's a page that says, there's a note that talks about the responsibilities of the association versus the buyer, and they need to get the documentation to figure out what's what, so they know. Because most of the time at the inspection, we don't know.
Well, many of the condominium documents don't spell it out either. So,
They're intentionally vague.
Yeah, intentionally
Right.
vague so that the association can dodge it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Is it okay to accept a finder's fee from a security company?
As long as it's disclosed.
I was going to say, it probably just goes back to a disclosure issue.
Well, it would depend upon what your state says.
Right.
So you have state regulation that probably has, we know it has an SOP, but you probably have a code of ethics. From ASHI's perspective, it is not. And the SOP or the ethics committee has ruled on this several times. So, it's pay for play, essentially.
Interesting.
So from ASHI's perspective, it isn't, but your state may allow it. And that's what matters.
Back to what Anatol was saying regarding report formatting. I agree. If you're using color in the copy, you got to relook at that, because people are going to print it out in grayscale. It's going to get a third copy somewhere, and any sort of color coding just goes right out the window. So you got to assume that people are going to print in black and white, at least the guy that's actually going to need to look at it and see what it understands, or girl. Similarly, I'm a big advocate for the address, the inspector's name, and how to reach the inspector on every page of the report, because you never know when somebody's going to end up with just a single page that's electrical, and he's gotten no concept of who it's from, what the house is, and it's helpful to have that information on every page of your report. I'm curious, we'll do that in the audience. Is anyone here still doing a handwritten report? All right.
Will you discuss what a stranger calls you about if they have one page of your report and wants to talk to you about it?
It depends on the situation, and oftentimes, like a lot of times it's with new construction, and I will have been to the property several times, and the client has authorized me to talk to the builder. Yeah, I'll do that. If I get a call out of the blue, I'm going to start by calling the client and or the agent and say, is it okay if I talk to this guy? They have a question. Because sometimes it'll end up in the listing agent's hand. They're confused. They just need some clarification. I think it's important to be available as long as you're not giving away anything. Do we have any online input? Go ahead.
My philosophy is, if someone is calling me with a question, I haven't reported effectively. I haven't really done my job. You should never get a question after the home inspection. They should be able to look at your report, figure out what it is, where it is, what's wrong with it, and what they need to do. And whether it's going to be a costly item or not so costly item in general, if they know all those things, what other questions are there?
A lot of times the buyer doesn't believe them, or especially the listing agent doesn't believe that you're correct. So they want to question you about whether, I mean, especially with new build, the builders are always like, well, the inspector doesn't know because blah, blah. And there's some report they have. It happens to me all the time that I get questioned as to when I'm the listing agent, the seller questions it, and I give them the report and they look at it and I still don't understand what this means. You know, yeah, it happens a lot. No matter, you could write a dissertation and the person would still have questions.
Well, I do a lot of new construction inspection, just technical inspections. And if I quote the building code that requires something and I include a photograph showing that something is not there or that it doesn't comply with the manufacturer's installation instructions, there's no question about it. I mean, people can argue and say, well, that's the way we always do it. Well, they're wrong. And I've already demonstrated that in the report. So what question is there? Yeah.
What do you do when the authority having jurisdiction has already passed that part of the property and it's final, good to go?
Everybody involved in construction knows that that's essentially meaningless. So and I actually include a section out of the building code that says that I'm going to paraphrase because I can't remember the exact text, but it says an inspection that presumes to violate the provisions of this code is invalid. So that municipal inspection passed by the AHA is already invalid. So that's in the general requirements of the IRC.
The question that we always get is, it's a new house. Why do I need an inspection? The city's been through it. The builders, it's got a 1-year warranty. Oh, do I need an inspection?
So Alan,
In
then we
my
got a couple of
opinion,
questions from the that came in here at the last minute. One caught my attention, and John Craner, you might be the one to address this. It's about the this thing that seems to be kind of weird down there in Richmond, where the real estate agents have all decided that home inspectors must provide cost to cure. And the specific question that was asked was about, does it violate the code of ethics for inspectors to participate in this mandatory cost to cure requirement?
That has been discussed so many times in Richmond at the local chapter level and at DPOR. It is something that goes back a long time ago, at least 25 years ago. It got started and it has stuck, and all home inspectors in the Richmond area, if you want to work, you got to provide cost to cure, or you won't work because the realtors won't use you. And if you don't put them, they're going to call you and ask you why they're not there. So it's nothing that says you can't do it. So it is what it is. Nobody
another
likes to
question.
do it. I don't like to do it, but I've just gotten used to it. But
So there's another question that's kind of interesting here. Would the members of this panel, so I guess that's all of you, support increasing the licensing and license renewal requirements in your own home state for the purpose of improving the reputation of home inspectors as professionals and improving the qualifications of newly licensed inspectors before turning them loose on an unsuspecting public?
Good Lord, that is the exact same question that agents get at every meeting. That is verbatim. Just change the word inspector to agent. Yeah. The answer from the agent community is yes, but I'll be curious to see what the agent community says yes, they should definitely have more requirements.
Well, from my experience being on the commission and serving on the complaint committee, the answer is a hard yes. The problem is the wheels turn super slowly. I would like to see personally some sort of apprenticeship program, because you can't imagine the number of inspectors that came through, especially the young ones when they were getting the complaints. And we would talk to them as part of this process. We would usually have an informal hearing with them and explain the concerns that we had with their report and the complaint and all that stuff. And they were, for the majority, they were clueless. I don't know how they passed the exam. It was not obvious to me how they could have possibly passed the exam. And we would send them back for remedial education. We sent several people back, and they had to redo the 72-hour course before they could practice anymore. Plus, so there's definitely the need for improved education. And I don't know how to fix it, but I would certainly like to see mentorship or an apprentice program, because as it is now, anybody who passes the home inspection or the national exam, has a college or a high school degree, hasn't committed a felony, boom, you're in.
I'd like
And
to.
you can have a license without ever having performed an inspection or been
I'd like
reviewed
to
for.
Wellman,
Yeah, I'm sorry. I teach the home inspection class at Frederick Community College, and I've been doing that for about the last 8 years. And one of the interesting things is that Maryland requires to become a home inspector, you must complete the 72-hour course. It does not say you have to pass it. You have to complete it, which is just absolutely amazing to me. So you could just attend the class, flunk all the tests, and still consider to have taken the class. I think it's far too short. Not only that, but the topics that I have to teach, according to Maryland, do not line up with the topics that are on the National Home Inspection exam. The NHIE changes their content every couple of years when they do their role delineation study. There are many items that are going to be on the exam that are outside the Maryland standards of practice, but in order to properly prepare my students, I have to cram them in to this class. So it's very challenging as a teacher to be able to get the required knowledge across to my students.
Well, Velma, we don't issue a certificate if they don't pass the test.
you would mean Hollis Inspection Incorporated, or?
The Home Inspector Training Academy will not issue a certificate for people who failed the test. We allow them to take it multiple times, however.
With help from the proctor?
with the help of the 2 fresh $20 bills. No.
So we are at the end of this session, but I want to say that the main takeaways I heard were review your report writing software to make sure it's conforming to the standards that you're supposed to utilize. Proofread your report so you're not sending out gibberish or things that don't make sense or incorrectly spelled. Include important pictures, but not too many. Am I leaving anything out? Oh, and be nice to the realtors. Don't be mean to the realtors.
I just appreciate you letting me come into the Wolf's Den. So thank you very much.
And I'd like to give Joe a round of applause for doing that, because it takes a lot.
Thanks, Joe.